So first, I thought we would, the three of us, describe and talk about the current project that is installed in the Graphite exhibition. At first, when the show was coming together, I was worried that it was going to be dreadfully monochromatic. And luckily, Geof provided some much needed color with his neon that is a part of it. But the piece started actually quite different. It was a completely different work that Geof was considering. Geof, would you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for coming. And if you haven't gone and seen the show, it's great, and this conversation might be really boring as well without going to look at the work, and I encourage you to do so. The first iteration of the project, which now that I think about it and looking at it, hasn't changed that much in idea, but radically in form, was a hanging cascade of graphite medals, like when you would win at the Olympics, but as opposed to a reflective, valued material like gold or silver, it would be an absorptive, inert material, graphite in the show. And like Sarah said, I was very interested in the kind of industrial and social uses of graphite. Like, I come from sculpture. I do a lot of drawings, but not traditional sort of pencil drawing. So I thought of the material sculpturally. And this idea of social value, which is something that I work with a lot, I was trying to think of how graphite could be utilized in thinking about larger social issues and social practices, and where I came was that of the individual, one that absorbs influence, absorbs culture, and holds it in the kind of either perversions or effects that social forces have on the self. And so moving forward, rather than kind of an ordainment of the metal, I thought of the figure itself being the absorptive material. And we'll look at some earlier work, and I think a lot about the figure a lot. And there's often absent figures or apparatus that is used by the figure, but frankly, I never had enough courage as an artist to insert the figure into the work more literally. And I think that has a lot to do with the kind of artistic culture I grew up in, where figurative art was sort of, not cool or prohibited in, art school culture. And I think now I know myself well enough as an artist, and I was sort of ready for the challenge. And Sarah in the IMA was, awesome enough to commission this project, and it made sense. So the piece in there is without a doubt the most directly figurative thing I've ever done, but it's a three-dimensional collage that is then unified, which David is going to be able to speak about much more eloquently than myself, unified by the material, just as we are all sort of social collages of influences and backgrounds and cultures that have the sort of people problems that we all have within us, that is held together by some sort of unity. This figurative element is constructed by the state, by the city. So it's either the id of the self and the superego of the social forces, is how I tend to think of it. The sign hanging in the gallery having these sort of, you used a good word, it's not a demand, it's a notation. Remember what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Do you remember what that was?
Of the sign.
Yeah, the sign.
Their allegiances.
Their allegiances,
yeah.
So in the gallery is the figure, and hovering over it are the kind of social allegiances that one has to declare to or resist against.
So in the gallery there is the graphite sculpture, and then hanging from the ceiling is a salmon-hued, it's not pink, it's salmon, sign that reads, "For public institutions."
For obligations, for Fugazi. For those of you who don't know, Fugazi is a band from the 80s and 90s that was one of the first times, to make it slightly autobiographical, it was like one of the first experiences I ever had with politics and form coming together. So Fugazi, A, is awesome. And B, in an earnest, non-nihilistic way, tried to combine belief and kind of very beautiful form, in this case music. And it was a really big influence on me, you know, and like I saw that, you know, you could do politics without being didactic, without being sort of declarative. And, you know, I work with politics, but my art is not political. I take politics as like a subject matter rather than, you know, I'm not an ideologue in my artistic practice.
Well, David, perhaps you could speak a little bit about where you came into this project when you first encountered it, when you and Geof met in his studio when it was under development.
Well, I think Geof had told me I think I'm the only other person who's seen it before it was cast. So when I first encountered the object, it was the collection of all of the component parts, which are really quite disparate. That I'm not going to reveal all of them in the cast object.
You can. I don't care.
All right, here we go. No, but for instance, the globe-like form on the figure that was actually a shiny green. For instance, there are existing casts of other objects that are incorporated in, such as the ear with the hearing aid that is then subsequently cast. So in other words, it was a much more raucous, colorful, and jubilant kind of object that is not visible now. But what's really interesting, and I said this to Geof when I first saw it, is how well all of those component parts became unified once it was cast. Graphite really is a very bizarre material for the history of sculpture. It's you know, almost unheard of. So it has a really interesting quality. It's not quite as shiny as bronze. It doesn't have that same sort of preciousness, and but nevertheless, it has a reflective element to it. So what's interesting is when you look at the figure, all of these component parts seem at first to be one whole thing, and then as you begin to look at it, they start to dissemble a bit, and you start to see how different things could be fit in. This very tension, I think, is part of the work. I mean, one of the things I like about the work is that it's all about divisions, right, between the social and the individual, between the architectural and the figurative. The whole work is about putting opposed but interdependent terms into tension with each other. The cast figure itself does this because we can't figure out if it's one thing or a component of all of these other things that have gone into it. One of the things that was really interesting to me is that when I first looked at it, we were talking about it for a good 15-20 minutes before I saw the human jaw and teeth that have been incorporated into it. So, because there were so many different materials, I was focusing on all these other things and I didn't quite see it. Now that it's been cast as a unified form, the entire form looks much more, well, not skull-like, but head-like. But that jaw becomes much more prominent because it's been molded into the entire form itself. So one of the things I like about it is how much it repays very close looking. It's at first a very off-putting object. I mean, I'll say it's not pretty.
No.
Right? It's not supposed to be pretty, right? It's it is, you know, but nevertheless it establishes a series of relations to you as you begin to walk up to it. It starts to look like a skull. It then refuses to look like a skull. It looks like a mask. Then suddenly you realize you're looking into someone's ear. It's all about those sort of a series of stages of looking at one thing that then becomes, you realize it's something else. Again, to visualize the sculpture not as a solid thing, but as a shell is a good way to think about it, because that's really what a cast is, but all of those things are being held together and made into a coherent form by that cast itself.
And that's kind of...
Geof has used casting in his work before, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your previous work in casting.
Sure. I mean, I mean, it's really good to hear, and like I said, you are one of the only people to see the original, and that was something that I was both, frankly, very anxious about, but also really kind of jazzed at the challenge of getting this thing to be cohesive and disparate at the same time, just kind of the way we all in this room are, and that sort of formal gamesmanship in this piece in particular got really embedded for me into kind of the conceptual success of the thing, and I don't think it would work. I was thinking about this last night actually, and like thinking about the show in general. Like for me, one of the reasons I was excited to be in the show is that I've had this idea in different forms for a while, but I kind of needed your help to figure out what medium to make it in. Like this would not work in any other material. Like this object would be awesome and bizarre in bronze, but it wouldn't work, for what I was trying to talk about. And in a way, it's kind of great when you have the restriction of a curator telling you to do something, and it kind of generated a successful outcome for something that I've been struggling with for like years in the studio, trying to make this thing that's one thing but many things at the same time. Anyway, I have worked with casting. Thank you. I have worked with casting a lot. It's probably the technical area I feel most comfortable with. I went to art school, and like most sculptors, like I'm like a hack in a lot of different things. Like I can work in the wood shop okay, I can weld okay. But casting was the thing that I really geeked out on, and it's where my most advanced technical at the level it's at, most advanced technical facility is at. So this piece is all cast terracotta. It's basically a slip cast brick, made with plaster molds. And what we're looking at is 8 cast microphones and microphone stands. The name of this piece is called Public Sculpture Edits, and it's conceived as a piece of public sculpture where the protagonists are both individuals and a huddle. These things are both apparatus for communication and figures. Like, so they are both the things communicating and the things being communicated to. On 2 of the 8, it has real human hair cascading to the floor. And here's a detail. I really like Giacometti. This piece is very indebted to the kind of the surfaces and the figurative sort of skin that Giacometti sculptures have. And a lot of my work, I'm kind of reliant on something that's also in the graphite piece now I think about it, which is this idea of alienation, which for me means that for something to be contemplative, art is the kind of secular regime of social contemplation. Back in the day, people went to church and looked at religious art and thought about the world and how they related to it. Now, contemporary art has been given that kind of like social sphere. For me, for something to work, it has to be the thing it can't be this incomprehensible form because it's hard to form a relationship with something you don't know. But at the same time, it can't be life. It can't be social practice because there's not this critical distance that is necessary, in my opinion, to think about how something relates to you. And so the way I achieve that is through an alienated object. So specifically with this, most casts, that you see, all the seams have been ground down. It looks just like the one-to-one reproduction of the thing. I like that generation lost. So here with this piece, you see the seams, you see the modes of construction. And I think that's necessary.
Maybe David, you could speak a little bit about casting and its use art historically and how that relates to Geof's use.
Okay, I think it really helps to, Geof uses casting in a kind of in a conceptual and also highly practical and material way. And casting is an interesting practice, right? Because what it means is that you basically take an object in the world and recreate it through a liquid medium that becomes solid. Remember, most bronze sculptures you see, that's start as clay that is molded by the sculptor, that is then cast in plaster, which is then used to actually cast the bronze, because bronze, liquid metal is quite difficult. And so the casting as a practice has been used for centuries because of its durability and the ways in which it can absorb all these forms, but that's also really its meaning, right, is to actually capture something that was there in the world and then create a representation of it. So it's always a representational practice as well. This is harder to think about in 3 dimensions than it is in 2. When we look at a painting or a drawing or a photograph, we can say, oh, there's the 3-dimensional world, and we're looking at a 2-dimensional surface, and clearly that's a representation. Casting is always a representational practice in 3 dimensions. Much sculpture in the 20th century actually kind of shied away from casting for this very reason. This is the kind of figurative bias part of that Geof was talking about. So many sculptors started to make stuff with things they found around them, assemblage, welding steel, all of this. Casting, however, kind of fell out of favor, in part because it always read as a certain kind of representation that removed from the world. So you look at, for instance, the microphones that we were just looking at, we recognize them as microphones, but we would never mistake them for microphones, right? It's a 3-dimensional image of a microphone. And that distance is, I think, one of the things that's really interesting about casting, and also what Geof does in the work is to present this, to use the material in such a way so that we see the objects as we would in the world, or maybe try to see them. I think that's what's interesting about the new piece, is that it's not recognizable in all of its component parts. But it becomes something that is both immediately present, physical, tactile, but also always removed. You're always looking at a ghost of something when you're looking at a cast.
Which is embedded in the technology of casting, which is actually something I quite like as a maker, is that you always lose a generation, every time you make a new mold. So it's kind of like, it's a distancing thing that is not an applique, but an artifact of the technical process that's involved, which is a little of a bit of an insider baseball conversation, but I think it's quite important for the kind of conceptual frame that David's laying out.
Can you explain a little more what you mean by distance? Like why is distance good? Like what is distance? How does that function in your work?
Before you do, maybe a quick little metaphor for what we mean.
Yeah.
When you take a cast from something, it's like taking a photograph of a photograph. Like the more times you cast and you cast from something, you cast from a mold, you have more steps, you lose resolution. So imagine like taking a photograph or a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. It still may be recognizable as the thing, but it gets more and more distant, depending on what material you're casting in and how many generations are involved in casting. So again, you can't, it's very difficult to take a clay object and make a bronze sculpture out of it. You usually need the intermediary of a material like plaster. Each step you lose resolution. And so that's that distance that's always in. That's not just a conceptual distance, it's actually a literal.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe
that was set up for you, Geof.
That's okay. So perhaps now we can talk a little bit about Rodin, if that's an okay segue. As I mentioned before, Geof mentioned that he was thinking about Rodin in the development of the piece that's in our gallery. Geof, could you tell us a bit about your why Rodin was on your mind? And then David, I'd love to hear your response to that.
Sure. Well, I like Rodin, and so it kind of relates exactly to what David was saying. Again, David can speak about this more eloquently than myself, but for my knowledge, Rodin was the first sculptor that I ever really looked at where there's this beautiful tension that I basically tried to work with in the same way in the piece between the materiality and the artist. You know, so when you look at a Rodin, it's not classical sculpture where the bronze or whatever marble is completely at the service of representation. You know, the idea is this sort of technical perfection where the base materiality of the object becomes lost in pure represented form. You look at Apollo, you don't think about the marble, you think about Apollo. Rodin, there's this there's always this conflict, a very productive conflict, between the raw materiality of the bronze or the plaster or the clay and the form being rendered. And I read it as a kind of like empathetic gesture on the part of the artist, where you know he is making an object intentionally for the viewer's contemplation. And the hand of the artist is left visible as traces of his intentionality. And so with the figure in the Graphite show, there is hopefully this tension between the materiality of the graphite, the three-dimensional collage of the materials that the prototype was made of, and the unity of the final cast object. And that's right out of, you know, the 19th century French sculptural playbook, taken to an extreme. Rodin would not make what I made. So that's sort of, you know, I was jokingly saying, it is like a deranged Rodin, you know, taking him and making it more perverse. And to me, maybe I drank my own Kool-Aid a while ago, but there is like a perversity to the form that's in the gallery there that is a sort of like hysterical version of some of the work Rodin was interested in as well.
Well, Rodin is considered the father of modern sculpture, and for these reasons that Geof was talking about. And the best way to think of him is to compare him to some of his contemporaries at the time, like amongst the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, like Monet and Van Gogh. All of these artists emphasized the material practice of making art as expressive and meaningful. So the thick paint on a Van Gogh or the handprints and chisel marks in a Rodin were all ways of emphasizing the deliberate acts of the artist in the material that's visible as working material, rather than making it disappear. Prior to this generation, artists tended to want, as Geof was saying, the medium to be invisible so that you could see what was being represented. Another example is like the Statue of Liberty. I mean, that's a late 19th century French sculpture. No one ever really thinks of it as a bronze sculpture or as a metal sculpture, or if it's material, it's always the image that we have of it. Rodin and others begin to sort of break through and litter this. Now, litter these objects with traces of their practice and their process. Now, the problem is, of course, that we were talking about casting. Everything that we think looks as if it's been touched by Rodin usually hasn't, because there's a whole series of steps in which it's made. Rodin worked in clay. He then sent it to the plaster caster to have it cast in plaster, who then sent it to the founders to cast it in bronze. So what Rodin did was a kind of trick, in the best sense of the term. He overemphasized all of his marks and his practice so that it would survive these translations. And it has the effect of making the viewers, whenever we see, even though because sculpture is a reproductive medium, there's no original, there's always multiple casts. It makes the viewer think that at every moment you're seeing a Rodin, you're seeing one that he touched, and that you're interested in the object itself, not just the image that it's conveying, some faun or nymph or whatever it is, right? And that's really what's one of the things that's so influential in the 20th century, because other sculptors would take this idea of focusing on the material object in front of you, the artist traces in it, and then really ran with that. That's the story of the 20th century, even though it's a different direction than what Rodin was doing. But this is the powerful impact, because he made every sculpture he created be about him, right? About his traces on the object. So we don't really care if we're looking at a faun or a field worker that he sculpted. He was real, you know, it's all about seeing that sort of trace of the master's hand in it. So this is kind of a problematic thing that happens. And so what's interesting is that opens the door, however, to all of these different ways in which sculpture can be both material, can be about its own process, can be about its own traces. So the rough kind of quality of Geof's work and the casting makes sense, because that very roughness has come to mean process for a lot of artists.
But what's interesting, you know, but it's just a tool in the toolbox now. So if you think about that piece, that is a sculpture in two parts in the gallery. So there is, you know, this kind of hearkening back to a sort of historical way of working with the casting and with the kind of the signaling of the rough hewn, but then hanging in the same gallery is the sign, which has a totally different aesthetic and is about a totally different set of social circumstances. And the two, in 21st century sculpture, an artist has the kind of a palette of different sort of artistic social languages to choose from to build up a kind of overall kind of conceptual gestalt. And that's quite different than, you know, than what Rodin had available to him.
Well, let's think a little bit more about the figure or the character of the sculpture, and you know, it fluctuates between being very much figurative and being non-figurative. And you know, is it genderless? It's wearing an Hermes scarf around it. You know, is it who is this character? And so, please tell us what you think.
You can go first.
Yeah. Geof, you have to go first.
I think that's a really interesting question, and one I don't care about at all. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, the Hermes Scarf, you know, I mean, I've told both David and Sarah, like, I had a lot of anxiety about this piece. It's actually a quite different piece for me, and one that I'm excited about in that kind of anxious, new sort of way. And when I was making it, you know, I'm a very uptight artist. Like, I take a really long time to make stuff. And the only thing I did and right away knew was an awesome move was the Hermes Scarf. Like, I did that and I was like, that is great. And because it personified it, it made it, you know, an idiosyncratic individual. And that part was important. And it also, like, did this weird thing with art history, like the plinth becomes the neck, and like it's sort of, you know, it kind of like fucks with all the preconceptions of how sculpture is supposed to operate as an autonomous object. You know, it gave it like this, you know, other sort of interior psychology, at least in my own mind. So that part I was really interested in. But then there does come this thing of gender. Like, it's not a girl, it's not a guy, it's a citizen. Like, I think of it as like a citizen, meaning that it has the rights and responsibilities given to it by the codes that are hanging above it. And so your question is totally legit, and I think it's maybe a kind of, you know...
Well, it is kind of more of a question for the viewer, almost. I mean, you've made this ambiguous form,
right,
that we're kind of supposed to suss out. So, David, maybe you can help me here.
Well, no, I can't help you. Ambiguity is a key strategy for a lot of artists, because one of the things that's so interesting about it is that one has to identify with it. I think everyone will establish a different set of projections and stories about who that character is, which is quite the point, right? Mm-hmm. That it doesn't actually have any designations of gender, very few of age or anything like that. It's very, you know, it's decidedly neutral, because it is supposed to be this stand-in for the citizen more broadly. And so it has this, it actually refuses a stable designation, which is something, again, that many sculptors have done, and I find it to be one of the kind of the learned references that Geof makes. I mean, He's very modest, but he actually knows knows and plays with the history of sculpture quite intricately in this work. There's a lot of references to different kinds of key points in the history of 20th century art that he will put forward and then pull back from. And so, like the Hermes Scarf is a great example of this. Like there's this, this sculpture on a plinth and the plinth traditionally is like the frame of a painting. It keeps us distant from it. It makes us look at the object as if it's somehow special. And just to have the Hermes Scarf on it, just tied on, suddenly makes that figure back into an object. Even though, in addition to the fact that it personifies it in one way, it makes it more human, despite its unhuman visage. It also kind of makes it more like this is a thing that we are going to be looking at because it's got all these different materials that are then played on there. And the tying of the scarf is something that we can imagine untying as well. You can't imagine uncasting the object or taking down everything else, but there's a kind of playful little moment of immediacy in tying the scarf.
Do you think that's I never thought about that. Do you think that's because it comes from the world? Like it's the only like found object, or like we have like everyone has a pre-existing relationship with that in a way that we don't with everything else in the room. It's like a normal thing, so therefore one that we have a connection with. Like I like this idea that you could untie it, but you can't uncast it. That's a trip.
I think it's about fabrication. I mean, everything in the room is highly fabricated, and so its intentionality is there. You look at the neon triangular form. It's like you could struggle to figure out exactly how it was made and everything else, but it's definitely deliberate. The Hermes Scarf is a commercial product from the world, but it's also the only thing that we would find in the world.
Right.
In any way, so it has a kind of immediacy and everydayness that is about that kind of the relationship between the found and the fabricated.
I like that.
And can you tell me a little about the plinth? Because it's not Formica, is it?
It's MDF. It's a manufactured wood. The plinth was the hardest thing to make, or the hardest thing to decide upon. I spent months making plinths. And when it was on a normal plinth, meaning that it made this, I hope you guys have seen the piece because it's not, when it was on a normal plinth, meaning one that went all the way to the ground, made, in a normal square. Well, let me back up. The piece is a sculpture in two parts. It's not two sculptures in the room. So there was a formal problem of having these things have these very different historical languages, artistic languages, but being aesthetically cohesive, and therefore you could enter into the kind of conceptual issues that I was interested in. When the plinth made contact with the ground in a traditional way, it was too heavy. It weighted down, and therefore, kind of what David was saying, it made the plinth operate as a frame and sort of wall off the figure, and it broke away the sort of unity between the two. And so I really struggled with that. I didn't know what to do, and I made the plinth I made it just like on a stalk going into the ground. I made this giant sort of almost table-like thing, which was like a horrible idea. And I settled upon this disc, which gave it a float. To kind of, it keeps it a lot lighter. When you see there, optically, it tapers the waist a little bit, which allows the object to float a little bit more, which for some reason helps it tie in a little bit. It's just very formal. It's just a very formal problem. Color is really important. Like I'm an artist. Like I want thing, and so the white sort of plinth, which it operates as like a screen traditionally in sculpture, didn't work. It needed to be implicated in the form, hence the MDF, which I wanted it to be an intrinsic material, not a paint or anything like that. And I've done a lot with MDF. Like it's a very difficult material to work with, but can do really good things if you use it judiciously. Am I answering your question?
It is, because I was getting a little Richard Archschwager feel from it. So I saw the choice of the material to actually further the piece.
Totally.
Because it's a representation of a plinth.
Right.
It's not, I mean, if it was just a white thing, we would not even pay attention to it, but it's an odd material for a plinth. And so that way, it's like, it's calling attention to its plinthliness. That's an art historical word, you can use that.
By the way, if anyone has any questions, if any, like, please, it's much more interesting to hear from you guys.
Definitely throughout, but I would like to go to the next piece that you have up here for a moment, because throughout this process of commissioning, Geof kept saying how different this piece was than his past work, and how, you know, and in many ways it is going into a new direction. I mean, Geof is making a figure, an individual, more clearly than he ever has before, but formally there are many consistent elements. I mean, in the work that comes after this one, could you forward the slide?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I thought you meant after this.
Yes, you know, you've used the plinth before. Signs and signage and text have very much been a part of your work before. This is from a show from 2011, last year. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you're looking at two pieces. The sculpture, it's an installation that's thought out as a whole, but maybe. But the sculptures you see in the middle of the room are called modern ensembles, and photographs on the wall are black signs and social failure. Perhaps you could tell us something about this.
So we'll look at more discrete shots in a moment, but this is a solo show at a gallery, and you know, everything Tara said is correct. I mean, I am interested in the plinth and the kind of like position of the plinth within contemporary sculpture. These sculptures, entitled Model Ensembles, I made with a pyrotechnician formerly of the Disney Corporation. Nothing you see here has paint in it. What these are ballistic plexiglass cubes, like you would have between you and a taxi driver at a bank. You know, it's bulletproof plexi that are each one slightly different, but they're like yay big, let's say. And inside the void of the ballistic plex, me and this pyrotechnician designed some custom-made mortar shells using the same technology, for those of you that follow the news, that jihadists in Iraq and Afghanistan use for shaped projectiles, like the most effective weapon against US forces overseas, are these things called shaped projectiles, which is a very primitive weapon where you have a bunch of black powder, or they can use any kind of explosive, and a piece of shaped lead that, when the thing blows, throws the lead into the armored personnel carrier or whatever. But here I turned it into an aesthetic tool. So in these shells are black powder and gunpowder, but also various chemical combinations that, when they oxidize through the explosion, leave a very colorful residue. So taking a violent tool and turning it into kind of a free-floating signifier of violence. Each one is slightly different. So they have a very kind of classical beauty to them. It was very important to me that these were like very seductive objects. Like these had, like what David said, I totally agree with. Like the piece in the gallery right now is not pretty, but it's not made to be pretty. It's made to serve other aesthetic functions. These had to be sexy. Like I wanted these to be like desirous objects. Hence the kind of really rich, beautiful color. And they rest on an aluminum base and stalk, which is in this color, this kind of sculpture coming from God glow right now is because of this projector in this room. It doesn't really glow like that. Should I talk about this, or do you want to?
Maybe briefly, and then we can.
This is a series of photographs which. Some of which are now up at the MCA in Chicago, called Black Signs and Social Failure. I did a research project at the Special Collections Center at the University of Chicago, where I teach, and there they have the largest collection of political interviews and speeches in the United States. And I did, about a year's worth of research there, reading interviews with 20th century political figures, and highlighted the areas where they talk about failure, or talk about the ends, the limits of ideology. So Thatcher talking about the failures of capitalism, Mao Zedong talking about the failures of Chinese communism, Stalin talking about the failures of communism, so on and so forth. I then kind of extracted these things into a kind of concrete poetry, and with a hand model, made these sort of placards, which become a type of broadcast, or a type of cue cards, like telling someone what to say. So ideology becomes sort of object and becomes sort of signage, much like the sign that you see in the galleries.
I would love to open it up to your questions now. Does anyone have any questions for either Geof or David, or both? Roseanne?
When you had the moment that I saw that you said the name of public art editing, I saw the same of the piece, right? I saw the picture of it.
Public
sculpture
Yeah,
edits.
sculpture edit. Maybe it's because we dropped the Rodin in your introductions, but I know you even thought of the citizens of Calais as well. Okay.
Totally. That idea of like the individual and the collective, the huddled mass is something I'm really interested in. Like, not just with that project or this, but just, I really am interested in community value and like the expression of community value in form. And that sculpture is all about that, for sure.
That also reminds me, the title, I love the title of Public Sculpture Edits, because there's this idea, public sculpture is something that communicates. It's supposed to communicate something on some level to an audience, and you have these mute microphone stands. What are they doing? What are they communicating to the audience? What are they doing in general? And I think what we haven't heard from you so much, Geof, is sort of thinking about that idea of, the sculpture is hermetic in a lot of ways. It's hard to read. There are things that you recognize, but there's a lot that you don't. And a lot of your work for me sort of resists interpretation in some way. There's an ear which you recognize, but there's a lot that you don't. I'd love it if you could talk a bit about this idea of buried content. And David, perhaps you could say something as well.
Yeah, I can talk about that. I don't know if I would use the word buried content, but I think art can do a lot of things, and I have a lot of respect for art, and I don't think it has to. I think art can be easy, but art can also be a place to deal, like a social space to deal with complex problems. And just like in politics, everyone complains about all you get are sound bites and like easy answers to complex problems, which aren't really answers at all. I think art's the same way. Like, complex problems that are dealt with in the regime of art need complex solutions that take a while to unpack. And I finally feel okay about this. I think I make work that rewards deeper looking. Not harder looking, but deeper looking. And so I wouldn't use the word buried content, but because that implies like a kind of scavenger hunt or connect the dots sort of thing. And I'm not down with that. But I think the work that I make when it's successful, like if you give more as a viewer, you get more from the work. Having said that, like, I believe in beauty, and like graphite is like an incredibly sexy material, as you say, and like I wanted to make this kind of, dark, sexy figure. And so if you go in the room and just appreciate the surface of the sculpture, like I don't think that you're like not getting the work. You're just having a different experience with it, and I don't make any presumptions on the viewer's interest. You know? So, like those sculptures, like with the, with that thing, a lot of people like that thing with having no idea what it's about, and that's cool.
Well, I guess I would just say that in looking at your earlier work, that the piece in this show is one of the most difficult, in part because it's about things not being resolved, right? You cannot walk into the room with Geof's piece and think that you've just got it, right? There's no simple answer to it. It's actually about the divisions, the undecidability of where to start and even where to look. Like, do you look up? Do you look down? Like, this is there is no center to it.
I got a question for you.
Okay, when they're finished. Okay. So it's actually about, it's oftentimes we expect art, especially contemporary art, as Geof was saying, to be didactic and message oriented. And I think Geof's work in general, but this work in particular, poses a set of questions of how we have to struggle to keep these components in dialogue with each other as we look at them. I mean, they're formally very different. There's so many reasons why they should not be together, but yet he forces us to try and figure out that the continuities and the gaps between all of the different historical references, the very different kinds of objects, and I think again, as Geof was saying, it takes real time to look at it and also to not think that there is a message that's simplistic or that's singular there, but rather is a set of questions of how one finds oneself looking at the objects and perhaps even associating things that were not intended. I think there's a great openness to the piece that allows for that. But the piece is about not being resolved into a singular meaning. It's actually about division and unresolution. I just made it a singular again by saying it's about, but you know what I mean. So what was the question?
So, I mean, this is sort of giving away a little bit, but, as Sarah said, David and I are paired in a conversation that's going to be in the catalog, and we were talking about the sculpture before it existed, and he was like, everyone's going to look up the center of the triangle, of the sign. And I was like, that's crazy, no one's going to do that. It's like the most boring part of the thing. But something I was really keen on doing, and the room that the piece is in was designed for the show, and I kind of wanted this idea of a singular experience. Like, my dream viewer is like one person would go in there and be in there at a time, which is why the room's kind of small and so on and so forth. And I was a little disheartened when you said that. I was like, oh, really? That's really what people are going to do? And so now that you've been in there, does that call you? Do you still feel that way? Do you still feel that's like, because you called it the Schenectady, like it was like the emptiness of social construction, So I mean, not to put you on the spot, even though I am, but like, is that still like where you go, or is that still?
I went there.
You did.
No, I think one way to think about it is that is the directions of the two components. Casting in the figure is all about concentrating everything inward and holding it in. The neon sign is about broadcasting out. So literally they have different mechanisms. And so that center area, that center gap, I mean, it's supposed to have nothing there, right? And I feel like one of the things that we were talking about is, as I was envisioning it, which did look a little different, but as I was envisioning it, I was like, in many installations, when there is a kind of gap in the center, this is where people do tend to go. They want to see, they want to be at the center of it. They feel like that things will resolve if you stand there. And what I like about the piece, which is that even though I do think I and other people want to go there and look up at and all we see is the wires, and it's a completely uninteresting experience to be in the center of it. That seems to be very much the point, that that it is about this broadcasting out. But I mean, you shouldn't be disheartened by that. That's actually good, because then it suddenly means that the only way you can understand that component is to then retreat over to where the citizen is, or if we want to call it that. But to actually not try and be in a place where one has 360-degree
An
vision.
omnipresent knowledge.
Are there any final questions?
Before you see the sculpture, there's the globe, the salmon globe, that is in the movie. Can you talk about that? Is that something that you thought about beforehand, or was it kind of spectacular?
Happy accident? It was a happy accident. I mean, I'd like to say that I'm that good to like preconceive that glow, but no, but I love it. Like, I like how it's like this idea Dave was saying of like broadcast, where, I mean, it's like, depending on how you come in, it's either the first or the last piece you're going to see in the show. And so it kind of beckons you in, and it like pushes the kind of social energy out of the room. And I think that's actually like a really successful happy accident. Yeah.
I have a little follow-up just because I was surprised by how the salmon light actually affected the sculpture. And I was wondering, because since you hadn't actually seen it all together, how did you react to actually seeing the one being bathed in the glow of the other?
I mean, that part I did think about that. And when I was speccing the light for the neon, you know, I made the frame that the neon is on, but I did not bend that glass. Like, I work with a neon fabricator who is an amazing craftsman. And we've done a lot of projects before, and he is very indulgent of me. And he gives me a ton of glass, a ton of neon, and a small transformer. And I made some cast graphite and made like little test samples, because you know, we are all bathed in the information we are given socially. And so that relationship I was really interested in. And because graphite's so absorptive and pulls in light, I knew just from, you know, my responsibilities of being a good artist, it was really going to change the way the sculpture was perceived. So that part I had an idea. I wouldn't know at that wattage how strong it would be, and I really like it. It almost develops like a skin. You know, it's a really nice relationship.
Well, Michelle.
You mentioned that you've really been thinking about a piece or something like this for quite some time, and that the parameters necessarily didn't allow you to move forward. So, has this been kind of a milestone for you as an artist, as on your path, and how you will move forward, exploring other ideas that might be emanating from this, or is it something you feel has allowed you some closure, or maybe both?
I think the honest answer is that I don't know. Like, I just finished the piece. Like, it's kind of hard for me to figure that out. But this idea of like the insertion of the figure in a more literal manner, I do feel like that's a step. And like I was telling my girlfriend in my like pillow talk anxiety, like, oh, I don't know if it's good, but it's really different, and, you know, and that part, you know, I really genuinely feel, but milestone or closure, like, yeah.
I'll ask you again in 10 years.
Yes, yeah, that's a great answer.
Well, if you have not seen Geof's sculpture, I hope your interest has been suitably piqued today, but please do look out for their conversation in the digital catalog, which will be released in January, and we'll be sure to let you all know about it. But thank you so much, David and Geof, for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks for coming.